So welcome everyone to the UU Meeting House here in Chatham. I know many of you are just from up the road a piece, which is lovely to have you here. I am the Reverend Tracy Johnson, and I'm the minister here at the Meeting House. And this is the third in our series of Cycles of Life presentations, and we're delighted that Judith Felton can be here today to talk to us about grief. And most of you know that she is a Pastoral Care Associate over at St. Christopher's. And so we welcome her and delighted to get started.
I hope I don't eat my microphone. This can probably be more informal than I had, that my notes imply. But let me just, many of you know me pretty well. It's sort of like, oh, Judith, let's invite all your friends to your presentation. So, as many of you know, I'm the Pastoral Associate at St. Christopher's. Does this sound like it's really booming? No, okay. And in my role there, I offer individual and group counseling, not only around grief, but any other kinds of transitions and spiritual direction that an individual might need. I also assist clergy with home visits and hospital visits, and I oversee a group of trained lay pastoral ministers, of which Richard is one. This is Richard, now you know. Before I came here, my husband and I lived in Connecticut for many years, and we were both professors at a community college, and so if you were to put titles after my name, it would be Judith Felton, MSW, I'm a social worker, and Professor Emeritus of Human Services and Social Work from teaching in the state of Connecticut. Also on the side in Connecticut, I practiced medical social work, and in that regard, I worked alongside hospice teams and other medical social workers. Most of my work was in home care medical social work, but worked alongside hospital medical social workers as well. As many of you who are here know, I now live full-time in Chatham with my husband, and I'm just saying a relatively new grandmother of 3 granddaughters, and expecting a grandson in December. Not that you need to know all of this, but just I can't introduce myself without saying all that stuff. And I think the pandemic just contributed to all this procreation. So they were having fun. What I'd like to do to start is just have you share with me and with one another, just say your name and just what brought you here to this presentation today. What is your interest in being here this morning? So, yeah.
My name is Gail Smith, and
Yeah.
my name is Gail Smith, and I'm a retired Episcopal priest, and there's a lot of grief in everybody's life, and I think that it's all important for us to do that. And grief is more than just if someone's died. So there's a little bit of grief when you retire.
Oops, sorry. Yep. Casey Kemper, I'm from Brewster. My wife Mary and I are good friends with Judith and Greg, and I'm curious about what Judith does. So I'm going to find out.
I'm the father of Judith. I'm Greg, her spouse, and I'm looking forward to listening to her as I have most of my life. So this is great. Look forward to this.
Hi, I'm Debbie Zaka, and I'm part of the pastoral care team at this church.
I'm Beth Avery. I live in Orleans. I'm here because I know that from here on in, I'm going to be dealing with losses of many different types and am experiencing them now. So all of the hints and all of the company and all of the conversations we can have on that I greatly appreciate.
My name is Marty Cavanaugh, and I'm here because I recently lost my wife, and I was invited by Judith.
My name is Ellen Zion. I'm a friend of Judith and Greg's, but I'm also here because my husband is in hospice, and so I'm preparing for grieving, and grieving already. So.
And my name is Janet Kilman. I'm a friend of Ellen's. She invited me to come with her today, and I do know Judith a bit. I lost my mom to cancer. She was very young, 55. My father to cancer in his 80s, and at the same time was going through an unexpected divorce. So a lot of stuff has gone on in the last 7 or 8 years, and I think it's always good to kind of get in touch with yourself. So.
I'm Charlie Kluge, and I'm in Judith's Thursday morning bereavement group at St. Christopher's because I lost my wife, Carol, 4 years ago.
I'm Elaine Steinacker. I'm also in Judith's Thursday bereavement group on Zoom, and I lost my sister a year and a half younger than me about a year and a half ago.
And I'm Tracy, as I said, and outside of the fact that I would just always be here because we're having a presentation this afternoon, I know that grief is very much a part of our lives in so many different ways. We have losses that we don't even think of as grief, and they truly are, and so the more we can know about that, the better off we're going to be. I also want to make sure that we invite the folks on Zoom to introduce themselves as well.
Hi, I'm Richard Johnston, and I lost my wife 2 years ago and started counseling with Judith then, and I'm in both of our bereavement groups. Charlie's in one, I know Alan, and anyway, that's why I'm here. I'm just trying to get as much information as I can.
Thank you. So, yes, could you introduce yourself, please?
I'll start if you'd like, Judith.
That's great.
My name is Catherine Cavanaugh, and I'm Martin's sister. And Mary Cavanaugh was my sister-in-law. And I met you briefly a couple weeks ago at the house. And when Martin told me about this gathering, I was very interested to attend and listen and learn and support my brother and my nieces.
Thank you, Catherine. Danielle?
Hi, I'm having trouble seeing here. I was planning to be there in person, but I've got some minor health issues I'm dealing with, so I couldn't be there today. But so I appreciate the Zoom, and I'm there. I feel that the seminar is extremely important. All of us deal with grief throughout our lives. So I feel that this kind of seminar is really important for everyone because you don't expect to be hit with it. And if you can prepare yourself a little bit, even when you're not directly impacted, I feel it can only help for when one is impacted. So thank you for doing this seminar for us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Danielle. Emily, are you there?
Hi, my name's Emily Cavanaugh, and I'm here because I recently lost my mom.
Thank you, Emily. And I'm not sure who AV is. Is that you, Joe? There you go. Well, welcome everyone. And I'd like to start this morning with a poem by John O'Donohue. Many of you are familiar with this poet. And And I think starting with this, some of the themes I'm going to talk about, you will hear themes in this poem that my themes will echo. And this poem is called For Grief. When you lose someone you love, your life becomes strange. The ground beneath you gets fragile. Your thoughts make your eyes unsure. And some dead echo drags your voice down, where words have no confidence. Your heart has grown heavy with loss, and though this loss has wounded others too, no one knows what has been taken from you when the silence of absence deepens. Flickers of guilt kindle regret for all that was left unsaid or undone. There are days when you wake up happy, again inside the fullness of life, until the moment breaks and you are thrown back onto the black tide of loss. Days when you have your heart back, you are able to function well, until in the middle of work or encounter, suddenly with no warning, you are ambushed by grief. It becomes hard to trust yourself. All you can depend on now is that sorrow will remain faithful to itself. More than you, it knows its way and will find the right time to pull and pull the rope of grief until that coiled hill of tears has reduced to its last drop. Gradually, you will learn acquaintance with the invisible form of your departed, and when the work of grief is done, the wound of loss will heal, and you will have learned to wean your eyes from that gap in the air and be able to enter the hearth in your soul where your loved one has awaited your return all the time. Amen. So I'd just like to take a few minutes before I begin again. I keep beginning. It's kind of what grief is like. You're just always beginning again. I'd like you to take a moment, and with the pad of paper that was given you, just take a moment to write down any thoughts or questions or anything you want about grief. If you want to just draw a big mess of wires that keep crossing each other, that's okay too. But any words or thoughts, just brainstorm for a second. We're going to save this for later. So just take a second to write any words or thoughts or questions or help you may need.
Ah!
So feel free to use this pad of paper just to jot down any thoughts as I give my very brief remarks. And good morning or afternoon. Nice to have you here. So I want you to know that I've really pondered about how best to approach our time together this afternoon. I've really been racking my brain to figure out what to cover under this huge umbrella of grief. I'm aware that not one of us in this room has escaped loss and the myriad of feelings that come with loss. None of us have escaped the complex circumstances that contribute to grief, and there are many. Some of us are here today because we know grief through the death of a loved one. That's what's bringing some of us here today. Some of us are here because we are experiencing the grief that comes with growing older, just experiencing what it means to lose aspects of ourselves that we once knew, to not be able to do what we once did. We certainly don't look like we once did. And some of us and aging brings with it grief. Some of us are facing the realization that we lived with loved ones who are facing their own losses and capabilities. Some of us are here because the loss that comes with other transitions in life, divorce, estranged relationships, unemployment. So therefore, I'm very aware that you don't need a lecture on grief. That would be like me trying to lecture you on what it means to be human. And I'm not an expert in that or anything else. So what I want to do today is just share with you things that I have learned because of my work with people who are grieving. So I thought I'd start with a story. About 4 years ago or so, a gentleman came into St. Christopher's holding his wife's ashes in tow. And he came to St. Christopher's to see our priest and ask that his wife's ashes be blessed. He was then referred to me. And this began a significant and meaningful relationship that continues to this day. I have been blessed and honored to companion this person on his grief journey, and there's an emergency. I know it was planned. Unlike grief, sometimes we feel that jolt when we're living with grief. So I've been blessed and honored to companion this person on his grief journey, and I have seen him face highs and lows. I have witnessed him bounce back from the waves of grief that hit us so unexpectedly. I have heard him grow to the point of offering support to others, to being a mentor in grief. But mostly I have learned from him, as I do from all those I companion with in grief. This is all to say that anything I say this morning comes from a place of working with people who are mourning, who are grieving. My level of expertise, and that's a very strong word, and I don't use it lightly, nor do I necessarily think it applies to me, but everything I'm going to say today is what I have learned from others, and I just want to say that it is the one of the greatest honors of my life that I have been able to work with people who are experiencing great loss. It has changed me in ways that are very hard to express. So just bear with me as I share with you some of the things I've learned from the work that I do, and this is not in any particular order. But first and foremost, and several members in my bereavement group said, please say this. First and foremost is that the grief journey is not a journey of stages. No matter how many books are out there about the stages of grief, everyone I talk to and hear from says, nope, doesn't work that way. While there are some very universal responses to intense loss and sorrow, those responses are also unique to each individual. They are unique in how we feel. They are unique in what we feel. They are unique in the timing of those feelings. The feelings, we can say, yes, almost everybody will feel this, but when it comes is the unpredictable part. In other words, while many who grieve will experience feelings of shock, anger, guilt, confusion, I do not believe, nor have I witnessed, a neat sequential pattern to grief. And this can be disconcerting to people because they like the idea of, oh, I'm feeling angry this week, and that means next week I might bargain a little bit, and that means next week I feel pretty good, and maybe in 5 weeks I will have reconciled myself to all of this. And it just doesn't happen that way. Grief is a really jagged journey, as many of you know, and I really believe I'm telling you everything you already know. And sometimes this journey that has holes that we fall into. There's a really great poem about going down a street and you keep falling into a hole, and then eventually you realize you can get out, but you still like to stay in the hole. And then eventually you do get out, but you still go down the street with the hole in it. And then eventually you choose another street. But it's a very jagged journey. It's a journey in which individuals have to embrace uncertainty. We have to accept mystery. And we, in some ways, at some point, reconcile ourselves to the fact that it is an unpredictable journey. Everyone in this room is already at different stages of their grief. Some of you are really fresh in this. And so some of my words that I say today, some of you might find yourself thinking, that is just BS. And I can accept that. I can accept that. Because where we are in our grief process really plays to how we can hear words about reconciliation. Because when you're new, that feels almost impossible. Having said that it's a jagged journey and it doesn't go on in stages, we can expect, in some ways, to travel from a place of shock and disbelief through a place of disorganization and finally to a place of reconciliation. I have learned from those I work with that the primary feelings in this very initial stage of loss, the primary feelings are shock, are disbelief, kind of a numbness, just this sense of, some people are scared because they're not feeling anything, because the sense of being numb is so strong. Sometimes there's relief, sometimes, if someone has been taking care of someone for a very long time. There's also a bit of magical thinking. Some of you may know Joan Didion's book, The Year of Magical Thinking. And when I say magical thinking, it's that thinking of, this isn't real. She's going to come home today. I'm not going to put her shoes anywhere because she might need them. That kind of sense that this isn't real. There's a sense of, during this magical thinking phase, or this sense that can this nightmare please be over? How is it that the world can keep going on? Why is the sky blue when I'm not feeling that? How is it that people can go shopping when I've just lost him or her? And I found that the timing of this phase is really different for everyone, and it's really hard because people might experience this sense of shock and numbness longer than their loved ones think they should. They might be feeling this sense of magical thinking long after others think, gosh, can you believe she said that? She still thinks he's coming home. So this can be a phase where you feel very alone, and it's a scary phase to be in. But we do move on. We do move on, and we move sort of from this place of shock and disbelief to a place of kind of a sense of disorganization and chaos, and where you're feeling this deep sorrow, and you're feeling that sorrow so deeply that it impacts everything else you do. So there's a sense of despair sometimes. There's a sense of hopelessness sometimes. Sometimes there's a sense of anger. Not always, but people get angry at God. They get angry at the doctors. They get angry at themselves. So that happens. During this period of sort of disorganization and chaos, and you're all looking so depressed, don't worry, it gets better. During this time, we start to realize that grief attacks every part of us. You know, it attracts us physically, so that we feel, I've had people tell me they feel a fatigue and a malaise that they had never felt before. You feel kind of like you have the flu forever. It impacts us cognitively, that we sometimes can't focus. And that's really hard if suddenly you've become responsible for, you know, doing all the paperwork in the family and you can't focus. And you might find yourself perseverating over images or things you should do or things you should have said. And it attacks us emotionally for sure, that we're feeling, some people say, this is so new, I never realized I even could feel this way. You know, the feelings are so new. And spiritually, for those of us who, well, spiritually, that just is a big question. You know, when we talk about our spiritual lives, we're not necessarily talking about denomination or religion or Trinitarian versus Unitarian. We're talking about how our world, our sense of our world and ourselves in it is shaped, how we find meaning and purpose. And when one is in grief, it's really hard to feel connected to that question. And I often hear people say, I can't rely on God anymore, or what I used to do. I don't know how to pray. I don't even know if anybody's listening. And that can feel very disconcerting. So sometimes when we feel disconnected from our sense of meaning and our sense of the holy, this can feel very isolating. And so this is a period of time in this disorganization phase that can feel very lonely, very isolating. There's this part of us that we know has changed forever, but we don't know how to present that into the world. It's during this period of disorganization, and I never like labels, but I think you get what I'm saying, that it's so important during this stage to try to connect with others who also have experienced loss. And I'm not going to say loss in the way you have, because it's individual for all of us, but it's important to get with other people that understand grief talk. Grief is its own language. And most of us, unless we've experienced it, most of us don't know that language. So people we typically have gotten support from, we might not during this time. Our best friend might not be the person we need to go to during this time, because our best friend isn't feeling the loss the way I feel it. Family members, and everyone has really good intentions, but this notion of being with people who have experienced similar losses is really important. And to this point, a woman in my bereavement group encouraged me through an email to share the value of such a group, for her at least. And she wrote, "The experience of being part of a bereavement group opens so many doors." That's a really nice idea, to think that, boy, even when I'm suffering, there might be doors that open. Doors to our feelings, our thoughts, our experiences, and to connection to new people trying to handle their grief too. Perhaps bereavement group opens doors that we are afraid to open, things we would like to leave behind or would like to keep shut. The surprise being that the way to move forward is to really enter that door and explore those feelings. It's one of the most beautiful accounts of the importance of connection that I've ever heard. That if you open a door that you may not want to open and you go through it, that's the door towards healing. This same woman, in response to my question, what would you like to hear if you went to a talk like this? I was asking everybody that. I was asking the gas station attendant that, everybody. And she said, I want to hear that it will get better. So I guess I can respond to that. Though we can't cure or fix grief, nor should we, I have learned that we do get through this stage of disorganization, not by ignoring the feelings or walking around them, not by walking around that hole, not by ignoring them, but by embracing the feelings, naming them. It's so important to name what we feel, shaping them, integrating them into who we are. And by embracing these feelings, then we eventually get to a place of reorganization or reconciliation. But we won't get there if we turn away from that door. And when we get to this place of reorganization, wherein we begin to feel perhaps, and there's so many caveats, where we might begin to feel perhaps reconciliation, where we might begin to feel reconciled to our loss. And this can be 10 years from now. Again, there's no set timeline, but reconciled to the reality that we are different. Our life is different. We are beginning to have a new sense of purpose. We might have better control over our memories so that we might be able to replace an image of someone we've loved, that we've cared for, being in the hospital. We might be able to replace that image with that same person hugging our children or opening up a present under the Christmas tree. It's at the beginning of this, it's hard to have control over what images come in. But when we get to a place of sort of reconciliation, we do have better control over our memories. We are able to remember our loved ones more readily with a smile and with gratitude versus pain. It takes a while, but we get there. And we might, a word was given to me yesterday, we might start to feel a sense of expansiveness, an openness. Even, our heart is a big place, perhaps feeling open to new loves even. We might be able to be open to that question of what next. I found, here I am telling you I don't believe in stage theory and I'm talking about stages, but I found that what's so interesting is sometimes within the very first month or so of someone experiencing loss, someone will come up and say, well, so what are your plans? What's next? You're going to sell the house? You're going to stay around? You're going to take renters in? That's a good idea. And you're in this first, and you can't even begin to answer that question, and again, nor should you. We shouldn't be making big decisions in that first part, or even a year is my feeling. But when you get to a place of reconciliation, you can start to explore that question of what's next without feeling quite so scared. It's a scary question, but when we get to that place of reconciling our loss more fully, then we might be able to play around with that question. So yes, to my friend who said, tell me it will get better. We do heal, and we come to a place of wholeness again, even though we might, when going into the grocery store for a quart of milk, see our loved one's favorite pie and burst into tears, even though we are at a different place. So those waves still come back, as John O'Donohue said, the ambush of grief. An anonymous poet wrote, grief is like the ocean. It comes in waves, ebbing and flowing. Sometimes the water is calm, and sometimes it is overwhelming. All we can do is learn to swim. I like that since I'm a swimmer, So another thing I've learned from the people I work with is that the journey of grief is a sacred journey. And as with all sacred journeys, walking with grief must not be rushed. Rather, the journey must be honored. As with all sacred journeys, the quest is for meaning and purpose, now that life has been changed irrevocably. And sacred journeys imply or ask us to be comfortable with questions versus answers. So sacred journeys ask us to be comfortable with mystery. This is one of Richard's favorite words, the embracing the mystery. I think when we realize that the journey of grief is a sacred journey, we have to trust. We have to trust that at any given moment, we are exactly where we are supposed to be, as hard as that is. That at any given moment, what it is we are feeling is exactly where we are supposed to do. That's what makes the journey sacred. And it reminds us that we need to be still. We need to be still, as we talked about earlier this morning. We need to be still in the presence of uncertainty. We need to allow for quiet, for silence, and that's very hard for some of us. It's really easy for me when I'm experiencing a loss to get as busy as possible. Give me some projects. Let me just work on something, please, because if I sit still, it's going to hurt too much. But part of the journey being sacred is to allow for the stillness. It takes a lot of courage to do that. And I'm always comforted by the base of the word courage means heart. It's from a French word. I'm sure I won't pronounce it right, so I won't try. But it means heart. And so while courage requires a certain amount of strength, which we all have, but it also means take heart. Whatever it is you're experiencing, take heart. And this is hard because we're all more comfortable living in the head than the heart. It's not hard to analyze. I often say to my bereavement group, will you get from the head, please? They're really great at analyzing, and did you read this book? And da-da-da-da-da. And I'm always saying, come down here, come down here. I've also learned that grief work is the hardest work anybody will ever do. And I'm bringing this up, one of you said I'm hoping to find some tools and so forth. And I really think acknowledging with someone that you're doing really hard work, because we're not very self-forgiving. We expect so much of ourselves. Oh, I shouldn't be feeling this way. How can I feel like I'm stuck. It's been a month, and you're not stuck. The stuck has such a negative connotation. You're just in a different place. But it's really, really hard work. And it's work that leads with the heart. Again, I'm just saying what I just said. And it's heartbreaking work. It's heart-wrenching work. But the work of grief eventually heals the heart. I really believe that. If we allow ourselves to grieve, we will heal. And sometimes the work of the heart allows us to be more open with our heart. Grief comes from love. Grief comes from love. And as C.S. Lewis said, I think it was C.S. Lewis, he said, great grief comes from great love. Great grief comes from great love. And it is grief, it is through grief, that is how we honor the person we loved. If we don't grieve, we're not honoring that love. In some ways, if we allow grief to walk with us, we allow the presence of the absence of the person we loved to walk with us. So when we allow grief to be our companion, in some ways, the person we loved is right next to us. And so we're honoring that. If we grieve from the heart rather than the head, then we won't block the grief, and we don't want to block the grief. I read a passage that ended with this: grief is just love with no place to go. And so I think that's a beautiful way to think about grief. But I can hear some of you saying, I've heard it said many times in my groups, make it go away. Make this feeling go away. Please fix it, Judith. And so, of course, I say I can't. But I like this image of grief as an uninvited guest that won't leave. Have you ever given a party where you say to yourself before someone arrives, oh, I hope he doesn't bring that person to the party? And there that person is. And grief comes to our door, asks to come right in, sometimes is very rude, eats all the food, and we try to ignore that uninvited grief. But the more we turn our back on grief, the more it tries to get our attention. And those of you who grieve know that. The more we try to get over it, as we will hear from the outside world, the more we try to get over it, the more we are reminded that grief is here to stay. So the choice we have, and boy, I can't tell you how many people just go, that's ridiculous. The choice we have is to befriend grief, to really see it as our companion. And we do this by letting grief guide us, by letting grief take our hand and let it comfort us. This is the entity now that's here with us. And grief is the one certainty we have during loss. Everything else can feel pretty uncertain, but grief is the one certainty we have, so we might as well turn it into an invited guest versus an uninvited guest. Our mourning, which is the outward expression of our grief, how we tell people about our sorrow, how we weep, how we do memorial services, etc. Our mourning will change, but grief itself will stay with us, and it changes us. It changes the decor of who we are. So in terms of how do I deal with this, I just always say lean into it. Lean into it. Don't block it. Just let yourself feel. It hurts a lot, but it's really important to feel it. And that's one thing I've learned from working with those I work with. I've also learned, and I'm blessed to hear this, I've also learned that there are many, many annoyances that come with grief, many annoyances. Cultural responses is one, where we do not live in a culture that, sometimes your work might give you a few weeks off. In some places, when we worked for the state, I think we only got 3 days for grief, and then you had to go back to work. So we don't live in a culture that sort of gives us a lot of time to deal with this. Some annoyances come from, not to sound judgmental, but some of the annoyances come from the silly things people say. Well-intentioned people, but the silly things they say, such as, are you still grieving? And that's, that word still I don't really allow people in my group to use. I don't like them to use, I should be feeling this way, or I should be feeling that way. So we've talked about writing a whole book about what people say. And again, very well-intentioned, but saying things from a place of not fully getting where we are. Another annoyance is the ambushes of grief that come over us when we least expect it. I've had people tell me that when they're living in grief, they feel like imposters out in the real world, that they have to put on a particular facade. People say, how are you? How do you answer that? There's a wonderful podcast that's titled, How Are You? Terrible, Thanks for Asking. And, and again, very well intended, but it's just hard to know how to be out there. It's hard to know how to go, if you've lost a spouse or a partner, how to go to the first dinner party as one versus two. It's hard to go to soccer games of your friends' children if you've lost a child. Hard to talk about where kids are going to college if you've lost a child. These things can be very difficult out there in the real world. So that's really important to acknowledge when people are going through that. The loss that someone is experiencing often becomes the elephant in the room. And I say this because I have learned over and over and over again that the person that has lost something very dear, the person who is grieving wants to talk about it. They want to say, oh, my husband used to love to put the lights on the tree and made a mess of it. Sorry, honey. But, you know, people, we walk on eggshells when we're being with someone who's just lost someone dear to them. And then many years ago, a friend of mine in the neighborhood lost her 14-month-old son. It was very unexpected. She had 2 children, a little girl and this 14-month-old son. It was very unexpected. He got a fever and he died. And a couple of weeks after he died, I invited her over. And she said the hardest thing is that no one will mention his name. And all she wanted to do was talk about him, but no one would mention his name. And I've heard that over and over and over again. So we can help others by addressing the elephant, by being a comrade in memory about the person that has been lost. So I've learned that also the most important thing I can do for a person who is living with grief is to be a listening companion. I think that's the most important thing, and you all know that. You are all involved in pastoral care of one form or another. We have to be comfortable with silence. You know, we have to let people just sit with us and be quiet. And this I mean really strongly. We have to drop every aspect of giving advice that we ever knew. People aren't coming us. I mean, I do have people say to me, fix it, Judith. But we have to be really careful that when we get uncomfortable with the silence, we don't come back with, well, have you tried this? We can present options to people. We can share our own story sometimes. But giving advice when it's unasked for, and even when it's asked for, is very tricky. Because I could know what's right for me, and it might not at all be right for the other person. But it's so hard, because it's hard to just sit with someone where they are. Because not only do people say to me, Judith, fix it, I would like to fix it. I would like people not to feel so sad. But we really just have to be there with people. What we can do always is to create a space for someone to feel safe. You know, you can come and sit with me. I won't judge you. I won't tell you to get over it. I won't say, oh, we don't want to talk about him. You know, that's what we can do for people, is to be companions with them in their grief. So those are some of the things I've learned. There's just so much more under this umbrella of grief, and I know I haven't talked for very long. It might be a blessing to you, but I'd really like to hear now from you, and any questions, concerns. What did you write on your little pieces of paper? And so let's have some discussion.